8 red flags you are dealing with an emotionally broken man. Look, this video is for you if you just don't know, right? Like, wait, am I just making this up? Are you second guessing yourself? Are you questioning yourself, right? Like, what's going on? Who's the victim here, right? Who's the perpetrator? What's happening? Like, if you're asking yourself those questions, or if in the past you have given emotionally broken men too much of a chance and you want to make sure this doesn't happen again, check this out. Number 8 is comparison. So when a man is emotionally broken, he will actually compare himself to others. And this comes, of course, from an innate sense of insecurity inside of himself, right? So when he compares himself to other men, like he's like more successful and this guy's more attractive, and you were probably like very interested in this guy and all of these things, that really shows that the nervous system on an emotional level is not secure, right? He's probably also not a secure attachment style either. He's probably more of an anxious attachment style. And so that's like, he has this, if it's like, he's like very other focused, and constantly like losing his sense of self, then you can probably think like, and rest assured that, you're dealing with an emotionally broken man, right? And, the thing is like, do not tip around, like walk around on eggshells, right? I can't mention this and I can't mention that I went on to breakfast with my colleagues, where they were also men or whatever, right? Like, no, don't do any of that, right? Because that's just gonna hurt the relationship even more. But rather, like, continue to express yourself, and if he moves through those emotions, he moves through those emotions, and eventually, if the relationship falls apart because you're not his savior, this rescuer, and we're going to talk more about that, then you're going to start actually attracting a man who is emotionally secure or healed at some level. Number 7 is sarcasm. Now, this is really interesting because you can uncover that very early on when you, for example, online date. And oftentimes men even use sarcasm already in their profile, or of course in their first messages, their first conversations. So very easy to spot. However, what oftentimes happens, especially if you are more the anxious attachment style, right? What happens is that you can be like, oh, he made a joke, ha 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 ha, because unconsciously you want to be liked, right? You want to unconsciously get his approval, right? And so because of that, you totally miss the point that he uses humor to deflect his emotions, right? Like he uses humor to actually distance himself from his emotions because he's actually emotionally broken. He is actually afraid, right? And I had a guy that I dated back in the day, gosh, when I was like 21, and he was constantly sarcastic, right? And of course, I was more in my anxious attachment style working model. So I didn't necessarily see it right away. I was working more on, him liking me, me not losing him, all those things. And eventually he also became condescending and so on. We're going to go into that. And so that's when I drew the line, right? But it was already visible by the sarcasm. You know what I mean? Like, and now looking back, he's like a total emotionally unavailable guy, right? He lost his mom when he was 18, which was just like a couple years prior and stuff like that. So like, there's like so many pieces that you can connect backwards, where you can connect the dots backwards, right? If you now think through the men who were using sarcasm. Number 6, and this goes a little bit into what I just talked about, he belittles you. Now, this goes like a little bit another step further, because now we're talking about making yourself better by making the other person feel worse, right? So there is sort of like this, you know what I mean? I'm only going to feel better. I'm going to make myself feel superior so you feel inferior. Now, needless to say, I don't know if I need to say that, but obviously that is abusive, right? That is absolutely disrespectful, right? This deserves complete boundaries. And I don't care if you had a broken home, if you had an emotionally unavailable parent, if you had an alcoholic parent, whatever the case may be, nothing justifies him disrespecting you at such a level, right? Because it's always about you treating yourself how you would treat your best friend. So if your best friend were to come to you and would tell you, this guy, or even better, like they come over together and you just watch him belittling her. Like, what would you tell her, right? Would you be like, oh yeah, this is a great guy, why don't you get married to him? Or do you actually say, girlfriend, let's have a girls' night. Let's have a chat about the future of this relationship, right? Because you're taking the way shorter straw here. And he's not, like, you know what I mean? Like, there's no way you can feel safe and secure with him, even though that probably means that he got belittled in his childhood, that he probably got abused at some way, shape, or form. Something happened, right? But again, you're not his savior, right? You're not his hero, so to say. Number 5 is he is always the victim. Right? So no matter how the story goes, he got into a car accident and it wasn't his fault, and this mean neighbor and this like super disrespectful coworker, and everybody was just like on him, and and it's just not fair, right? So he's like always the victim, and you're like, wait a minute, he's always the victim? Like, wait a minute. So he's the only one who's like the common denominator in all those stories. Like in all those different settings, right? Like with his friends, with his co-workers, like everywhere, right? Like, with strangers, you know what I mean? At his gym. And he's like always the victim. Like, what's happening there? And so here's one thing that's good to know for you for this one. It's when you have a partner who has sort of like this victim mentality. That means one of the things is that he gets attention by being a victim, right? He gets like, oh, poor Mark, let me help you out, right? Like, oh, mommy's going to come and rescue you, all those things, right? So he gives his power away. However, what you really want to do in this particular instance is not cater to the victim part, but rather say, you got it. You got to figure it out. You go, you know what I mean? You have this part inside of you that can conquer mountains and so on, right? So you only want to talk to the powerful part inside of them, rather talking to that victim part inside of them. Now, this is particularly important when you're even dealing with a narcissist. Oftentimes, covert narcissists are using that technique of being sort of the victim, right? And it's never their fault. But they're doing that for reeling you in. But the technique doesn't work if you speak into that powerful part of them, because now they don't get your attention anymore, right? They don't get your resources anymore, right? You're just saying, hey, you got it. You know what I mean? You got this figured out. I believe in you. And then there's, of course, they won't be that interested anymore. Now, this is one of my favorites now for the wounded animal syndrome. So this goes back a few years. My goodness. I mean, this is going back like, 10 years, 11 years, something like that. And I was starting to date this guy. I was like considering it, right? But I was like, I don't know. He's like, he doesn't really trust himself. Like there's something inside of him where he doesn't really feel good enough. But then he wants to compensate for it. And he doesn't want me to see that. And I don't know. It was just really unattractive, right? So one night, I just was taking myself out on a date, which, by the way, ladies, I highly recommend it. It's so fun. And I was going to the movies, right? And so next to the movies was a Starbucks. And I'm like, hey, I have an idea, right? So why don't I just meet this guy and I'm just being really honest with him. Because for me, it was always like, I want to treat other people the way I want to be treated. And so because of that, I said, you know what? Like, I would want the man to be honest with me, right? So I was honest with him. And then, I'm just like said that I was not really that attracted to him. And he said, well, you said like you've never had a boyfriend, right? Like, have you, like, are you, seeking help? Are you getting a counselor? Are you in psychology? Do you have a psychologist who's like all those things? So there was already sort of like this condescension of wounded animal syndrome. That was already starting to come out, right? But ladies, wait, it gets better. So then I get home, and as I make myself a yummy tea, by the way, I love peppermint with almond milk and all the things. So I'm just sipping that, and I'm so joyful because I feel like I just saw this great movie, and I was true to myself, and I ended it with a guy that was not in alignment with me. I got this bombardation of text messages, right? And he was like just telling me like, you're like a 5 out of 10. And you know what I mean? Like, I could do like way better than you. Normally I date like 10 out of 10 and you're like the lucky one and all those things. And so we call that the wounded animal syndrome, right? Because what that really is a shame shield. A shame shield. Okay, this is really awesome because that really sees like, okay, if you have healed that part inside of you, meaning like you're not going to attack him back, right? You're also not going to feel the need to belittle him, but you'd rather see, wow, he just feels so much shame inside of himself that he got quote unquote rejected, right? Although I just call it redirected because I made him like he can now meet other women, right? But instead he was like just really like felt embarrassed, right? And again, because this whole sense that I've told you about, this suppression, this insecurity that I felt, this not good enoughness, but where he was inauthentic about it, that was coming out. So if he has that also, of course, you can't trust him at all with that, right? Because that will never work because when they feel insecure, they will lash out. That's the shame shield of attack, right? And this is like absolutely a no-no. There's absolute zero, like there's boundaries. I didn't even respond. I totally ignored the messages. I just ignored them. I read them to my girlfriend and then I deleted them because there was like no point, right? So if that, like, it's also like a very immature man, right? Like who has to get back at you. Number 3 is the high chair tyrant. So now this is really fun because when I met my husband, he actually told me he was already a coach. And he talked about those archetypes that he had developed, like masculine archetypes. And he had developed one archetype is like the little boy, which is, of course, pretty known. But the shadow version of that is the high chair tyrant. So the little boy in its purity, right, is like playful and creative and like spontaneous and like, adventurous, all those things. But the high chair tyrant is saying, I know I'm cute, right? And I'm going to use that for my advantage. So when you think about a high chair tyrant, I want you to think about like a knife and a spoon, I want food, I want more ice cream, you know what I mean? And I'm turning your life into a living hell if I don't get what I want, right? So that's like sort of like this, like throwing a temper tantrum, for example, right? And it's like what just happened? Like, what is going on? You know what I mean? And you really feel like you're dealing like with a little boy, right? So your intuition doesn't mislead you there. It's called the high chair tyrant, highly manipulative part of the shadow masculine, by the way. So when that occurs, same thing. It's like, dude, get back into your king, and then we can talk, right? Like a queen doesn't interact with a high chair tyrant, right? She's going to set boundaries. So if you were a queen mom of a high chair tyrant, right, you set boundaries. You just keep doing your thing. You ignore the behavior, right? You give it zero attention. And that's what you also learn if any of you are in like childhood education, things like that, your moms, you've read lots of books, right? What do we learn? If we want to eradicate a behavior in a child, the recommendation is that you ignore it because most of the time, the high chair tyrant will use this behavior to get attention. So if you're like, I'm not entertaining. So you're not reaching me at all. You know what I mean? As a matter of fact, I'm really questioning if this is like the right relationship here, right? Number 2 is extreme emotions. I should have put extreme in bold letters. Emotions themselves are great. Look, I was actually completely emotionally suppressed when I started dating. I didn't cry. I also was never angry, right? I was just completely numb. And so as the years went on, I did my healing, I did my coaching, right? I went to UC Berkeley, all of the things, right? I learned to heal my attachment style, my emotions came online, all those things, right? That was suppressed. And then, of course, I tracked my husband and he expressed his emotions. So it's not about like that they're expressing their anger, by the way, without targeting. So there's no attack or extreme sadness, right? So you really want to make sure, okay, hold on a second. What do you want to look for? is, does this man have a certain level of stability inside of his nervous system? Okay, so what that means is it gives you sort of the sense of that he has capacity. It almost feels like this tree that has sort of roots, right? And if you don't feel like that this man has like really those roots, like deep, deep roots, right? Where the like a level, whatever, hurricane level, whatever the levels are, comes and the tree's still not gonna bend, right? That's what I'm talking about, the roots. And then he can go into anger and he goes into sadness. But he comes back to his secure, grounded, aligned, connected part. That's fine, right? We're talking about when he swings, he's like super abrasive, super aggressive, right? And same for women too, you know what I mean? And there's no responsibility. It's just like super extreme. And then there's no acknowledgement for that. Or maybe there is acknowledged for that, but it's just an apology, right? And he can't hold himself in that space. Or if there's just a total collapse and you just have to like basically, soothe him for like hours and hours or days and days, right? If that happens on the regular and he's not able to regulate himself in one way, shape, or form, chances are that he is emotionally broken. It can be extremely exhausting for a woman or also for a man, right? Like if you swing like a pendulum swing. I'm not talking about moving an energy through, like a couple minutes, just moving energy through without attack, right? Because the truth is, when we are embodied beings, we all have all emotions inside of ourselves, right? So when I did all my somatic healing work, when I got trained, so much rage, so much sadness that I saw in the people that were in my program, the people that I healed, myself, right? So we have that suppressed anger, that suppressed rage, suppressed sadness, whatever got suppressed, we have it inside of our body and it has to be liberated for us to come fully into alignment, right? For us to truly trust ourselves, trust our power, right? But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about if there's like literally, it just swings and there's no warning and there's no responsibility and there's no container. So I'll give you an example. And this is coming from myself, right? So when I met my husband, I said, you know what? Like, I'm just going to do my expression session, I call it, right? And I screamed, and that's what I teach my women in the program, so I'm just like doing my expression session, but it's very conscious. There's a container around it. I know where I'm going. I know how I'm going to release it. And then I come back and I feel so much more embodied and I feel so much better, right? I feel so much more relieved. Or let's say, a couple years ago, I had this like extreme like activation, I would call it, right? Where I just like knew I had to do something and it broke up so much like grief inside of me. So I just like laid on the floor and cried, but it was in a container. So when my husband came in, right, he's like, hey, are you okay? I'm like, yeah, I'm just moving stuff through, right? And so that's the other piece too. When you're in that emotion, when you have that ground, and I teach my women how to do that, you can only do that if you don't judge your emotions. I could actually shift into my inner adult in that moment, say, hey, yeah, totally fine. I'm just processing something right now. I don't know exactly what it is, but my body wants to move this grief and this sadness so that I can graduate to the next emotion that wants to be expressed. Okay? So this is really important to understand. So I'm not talking about, crazy and all those things, right? Like I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about honoring all of the emotions inside of yourself. And sometimes can be extremely uncomfortable because maybe there was no emotional safety in your household. So maybe nobody was expressing their emotions. And it was all brushed under the carpet. Okay? So again, extreme emotions, that's like something to pay attention to, right? If that's the case. And again, I'm not talking about if you have ground and express your emotions because that's great. That's part of the archetypes. And number one is addictions, right? If you notice, you know what? There's this part inside of my partner, like, who constantly has to sort of escape sort of like some reality, right? Because it doesn't really matter if they have like an exercise addiction, which, by the way, that used to be me. How I was dealing with my anxious attachment style was just like exercising in a gym for hours and hours until I finally had an injury, right? So, that's the thing. At some point, the body gives. And this was actually a good thing. And swimming for hours and all the things. But it can be porn addiction, it can be sex addiction, it can be video game addiction, food addiction. It can be just any addiction under the planet, right? But is there any addiction that means, I'm out of control somewhere, right? I'm somewhere not taking responsibility. I'm somewhere don't want to take responsibility. And I want to disappear. I just want to disappear. I just don't want to deal with this stuff, right? So there is this sort of escape. So when you encounter that, that's also because there's actually emotional brokenness underneath, because it's really saying that facing reality is too painful. So I rather just like go into my addiction land, right? And that way feel this like this spontaneous connection to joy, to pleasure. It's very short term, short lived, right? But I have that because I don't want to deal with the suppressed emotions. Okay. So let me know if you have any questions around that, but very powerful work to also focus on for yourself as well. If you found yourself in any of those categories, because I have to say, occasionally I was the victim, you know what I mean? Or occasionally accidentally, I even belittled my husband once at like a networking event. I wasn't even aware of it, right? It's because I watched it from my dad. So, just you'll find yourself somewhere as well. You want to be just honest with yourself. But again, those are the red flags that you are dealing with an emotionally broken man. Now, if you haven't done so already, take our free love quiz to get the man, the relationship you desire fast by hopping over to getlovequiz.com or click the link in the description in the comments below. Lots of love to you, ladies, and I will talk to you in the next video. Bye-bye.